Thank you very much for the kind words. Pleasure to be here in the Karolinska Institutet. As you said, this is really taking an approach from health and applying it to economics, and that's what this year's Nobel Prize recognized work that Esther Duflo, Chief Energy, and I've been involved in, but really that has really become a movement in economics, and I think this is a recognition for that entire approach. What I'd like to talk about today is give some background on the approach in general, how it's played out in economics, in development economics, but with a particular focus on some examples from health. And would love to discuss with all of you any thoughts that you have on this. And I'll also say a little bit about some work that I'm doing on water right now. And I understand that some of you took a look at an article on water. I'll say a bit about a different approach, but we would love to discuss that. Okay. So the experimental approach, and as I talk today, I think we're quite used in economics to thinking about trying to understand the world better. That's something that economists have spent time on, and we're also used to trying to communicate lessons for policymakers, and that's something that economists have done for a long time using other techniques. And as we use the experimental approach, it's natural to apply it there. But I think one thing that economists traditionally have not been involved in so much is working on innovation. But of course, in health and in many other fields of science, it's very normal that you're both trying to understand the fundamental scientific issues at play, but you're also trying to advance on specific practical problems and make technological innovations. And I think one thing that I'll emphasize a bit is that the experimental approach can be a tool for that. So you'll see me come back to that as well. Okay. So let me explain a bit about what I'd like to discuss. First, I'll lay out some key features of the experimental approach. Some of these may be that these are obvious to you. I'd love to get your perspective on it. But I think they weren't, as I'll explain, they weren't all obvious to me as I worked on this. I don't think they were obvious to economists as economists thought about this. I'll then try to give some examples. Then I'll talk about a broader issue that goes beyond randomized trials, which is institutions to encourage innovation more broadly. So starting out with the key features of the experimental approach. I first started getting involved in this in 1994, when I first started conducting randomized evaluations in Kenya. And when I first got involved in this, I saw them primarily as a way to cleanly isolate causal impact of a program or policy from potentially confounding factors. And that's what you would learn in a biostats course. That's what you would learn if you're an economist in an econometrics course. And that's indeed a very important feature of this. But I'm going to argue that that's really just one of several features. I'll go through 5 that I think are important. But so starting indeed with understanding causal impact. But that is indeed, I think, a very powerful tool. Trying to, economists traditionally had to rely either on our theoretical models, which often were based on the assumption that people were rational, or we had to rely on correlational data, non-experimental data. And one thing we found was that as we started to conduct these trials, is that things which we had a quite strong belief in, from theory, from common sense, or even from looking at the correlational data, when we looked at that with randomized trials, some of these things indeed turned out to be correct, but many of them turned out to be wrong. So the example you mentioned, it's an education example. This was on textbooks, and there's debate among economists who work on the economics of education. What's the impact of spending? And some people think if we spend more, we'll get more results. Other people argue, no, if the incentives for teachers aren't right, we won't get results. But even the skeptics in that world tended to think that if you provide textbooks, that will be you'll get impact, and that will be very cost effective. And as the example you discussed illustrates, so I won't go into detail. But we found in this case actually very disappointing results. And when we looked at the something quite fundamental about the education system being oriented towards elites in a way that made the textbooks very inaccessible to the typical student. And just as one example of that, I think there are multiple, but the text, this was in Kenya, this medium of instruction in Kenya, as I don't know if it is here, is in English. That was most pupils' third language. And in a rural area, it's very easy for pupils to fall behind. And that made it difficult for them to use the textbooks. So, the first element is causality, but let me mention a few others. And I think getting at causality is, before I go into detail, that was something that economists knew we wanted to get at. We knew that we were using correlational methods. It wasn't perfect. We worked on lots of statistical approaches to do better. So in that way, moving to try and get at causality wasn't that different than what we already knew we needed to do. But there were a number of other features that I think we didn't understand, and certainly I didn't understand when I moved into this, that I think have really opened up fundamentally new ways of doing economics. And maybe in public health, some people were already doing them, but let me list them. The first is, or I should say the second, is that experiments require economists to spend time in the field. So while most empirical economists previously worked with existing data sets, the experimental approach requires researchers to talk to patients, healthcare providers, depending on the field, small business owners, farmers, where they live and work, and understand and develop a much richer and deeper sense of context, which in turn is very useful in generating new hypotheses to test. So another feature of this approach is it involves addressing very specific practical problems, while also often shedding light on larger conceptual questions. And I'll try to give some examples of that. A fourth feature of experiments is that they're inherently collaborative. They require us to work with practitioners in governments and in civil society, teams of survey enumerators, and specialists in other fields, such as health. And that allows the ideas and experiences of a much broader set of people to enter economic research. I think economics tended to be a somewhat involuted world where we would talk to and write for other economists. And I think we still have a long way to go on that, but I think this is helping us broaden our perspectives. Another key feature is that the modern experimental approach is iterative, both within and across research teams. As we see in biology or in the market, if you have a system which creates variation in approaches and then selects for the most successful ones, that can be a very powerful force for change over time. And the iterative nature of experimental research, just to give a sense of this, we might have one experiment that tests the impacts of a multifaceted program. A second might try to break out the different pieces of that multifaceted program to understand which pieces are driving the effects, or might try to be designed to test the underlying economic or behavioral or psychological mechanisms at play to understand the impact. A third might examine if similar results hold in a somewhat different context, or if a tweak, a small change to the program could improve the impact. And this process of constantly iterating I think can lead to substantial improvements over time. I'll try to give some examples of these in a minute. But let me note that these 5 characteristics, the sense of causality, the rich context, the specific focus on specific practical problems, the collaborative nature of this, and the fact that it's iterative, these can be very useful for science and for policy. I won't go into detail on that, but I think they can also make experiments a very useful tool for innovation. And as I say, I'll give some examples of that, or at least one example. So as you heard, the first work that I was involved in randomized trials was looking at education. And we looked at a variety of things in education, including textbooks. And we saw, in some cases, much less impact than we saw and than we expected. In some cases, we saw some impact. But one of the, as you mentioned from the textbook example, things that we thought might work sometimes didn't work. But we also saw some cases in which things that one might not have immediately thought of as the most important things for health, for education, actually being very important. And I'll give an example from the health context. So one of the things we looked at was school-based deworming. So as many of you may know, more than 1 billion people worldwide are at risk of intestinal worms. They're particularly common among school-aged children, which is why the World Health Organization recommends mass treatment of children in endemic areas. Edward, Miguel, and I used the staggered rollout of an NGO deworming program to examine the educational impact. In the short run, we found that for children included in the program, school absences dropped by 1/4. And we found that it wasn't just children who were dewormed who benefited. So other children in the same school also had lower worm loads and better educational outcomes, presumably because mass treatment decreased disease transmission. We also saw some evidence of spillovers to neighboring schools. And we later went back and followed these same students when they were young adults. And when we did that, we found that the program had increased the fraction of girls finishing primary school and entering secondary school. And we saw that the program, the students who'd been exposed to the deworming, mass school-based deworming longer, were earning more. And in fact, the increase in earnings was enough to pay for the cost of the program 100 times over. These medicine is very, very inexpensive. In fact, just the increased tax revenue governments would collect as a result would more than offset the program costs. So with technical support from NGO Deworm the World Initiative and Evidence Action, the Kenyan government decided to, after seeing these results and after a process of working with the Kenyan government decided to scale the program nationally, reaching millions of children. Then we worked with Indian states, and in fact, there was some technical assistance provided by people from the Kenyan government who'd been involved in the Kenyan program in helping Indian states set up programs. And then the Indian national government set up a program. And now, as a result of the process in Kenya and India, more than 150 million children are being treated each year. So this is an example of the type of policy impact that can happen, and that's obviously familiar to those of you in the health world. But in the economics world, this tends to be a much longer process. Let me focus not on the direct, purely health aspect of this, but on the health economics aspect. So when our work started in the 1990s, many policymakers and both in multilateral institutions such as the World Bank, but also in NGOs, including the partner NGO we were working with, thought it was very important to charge people for preventive health products, such as mosquito nets, water treatment solution, deworming pills. We had developed a relationship with the NGO then, and what we initially started just evaluating their programs, but by then we had a relationship, and we talked to them and convinced them to at least try in a subset of schools, providing the deworming pills free rather than their usual practice of having to charge. And we found that even this very small charge the NGO made, less than 40 cents US cents per child, dramatically reduced take-up of the deworming medicine. So that instead of 70% of people using it, it went down to 17%. I think, by the way, it was 70% because it was part of a study. Parents had to sign up, and without that, I think it would be close to 100%. So
that work suggested even a very small fee could have a huge impact on preventive health behavior. And a series of papers by Pascaline Dupont and others found the same pattern in many other contexts. So for mosquito nets, as I'll discuss later, for water treatment solution. And Pascaline and her co-authors found that many of the hypothesized benefits of charging turned out to be illusory. They weren't real when you tested for them. And in part because of these results, there have been big changes in health policy. And inexpensive preventive health products are increasingly provided for free, saving lives and improving health for millions of people around the world. I won't focus on this here, but one question, economists typically assume rationality. And these findings that even a very small fee could lead to huge changes in the fraction of people using preventive healthcare products was a bit of a challenge for economists' typical view of humans as rational. And in that area and in other areas, as we've applied this experimental approach to development economics, I think we're seeing increasing evidence to move us away from that view towards a view, and simply saying, well, we should move away from the assumption that people are rational. Well, I think economists knew, yes, our models have them as rational, but we know that's just an approximation. That was the typical rationale for this. I think a huge development in economics has been the growth of behavioral economics, which proposes very specific models of the types of mistakes that people make and types of departures from rationality. We've been able to test some of those specific mechanisms, and that in turn can help feed back into policy or into product innovation. So I won't go into that in detail here in terms of how we isolate and test those theories, but I would like to give an example of how we use some ideas from behavioral economics. Okay. So let me give an example from water. So as I'm sure everyone here is familiar, diarrheal disease is a major cause of child death in low-income countries. It's the second largest cause of child death in Kenya. So Ted Miguel, Jessica Leno, Alex Wane, and I evaluated an NGO project in Kenya in a region where open springs are an important source of water. Both in tradition and in law, people in the area had the right to collect water from springs on their neighbor's land. But the springs were easily contaminated, so the NGO protected them by encasing the sources in concrete. The project evaluation found that there was a sharp reduction in E. coli counts at the source. So E. coli being, as I'm sure everybody here is familiar, that's an indicator of fecal contamination. Those fell about 2/3 at the source. And diarrhea rates fell by 1/4, so there was an improvement from this. But the spring protection led to a much smaller improvement in water quality in people's houses than it did in the source. Water quality, the E. coli counts in people's houses fell only about 1/4. And that's because the water became recontaminated, either in transport or in storage. And again, that's something that we could understand with a sense of the context that came from spending time in the field. People store water in large pottery containers. If you want some water, you may scoop it out. Your hand has some fecal matter on it, as it might if you're 4 years old. Then there might be fecal contamination of the water. So we had to work on trying to come up with a better solution. Here's where you see how we moved from testing something, finding that it worked, but not at the appropriate level, to trying to move towards innovation. So we saw that, so there's, one approach is to treat drinking water with dilute chlorine solution. So this kills many of the microbes. It keeps the stored water safe for 1 to 3 days. Now, water treatment solution was socially marketed in Kenya. It was sold in very small bottles for household use, about 20 or 30 US cents for a bottle that would last for a month. But many households were not able to do this. As I argued earlier, even small charges for preventive health can be a major barrier. And we tested multiple possible solutions. Be happy to talk in Q&A about some of the other approaches. But one of the approaches was this type of chlorine dispenser that is put directly at the water source where people are collecting their water. And that way, when people collect their water, they can add the right dose of chlorine solution by turning the knob. So in designing the dispenser, we tried to use some results from previous studies and some wider lessons from psychology and from behavioral economics to try to increase usage rates. So we made it salient. As you can see, this is a big, bright blue dispenser right at the water source. It was incorporated into something that people already did, water collection. So it was very convenient and could quickly become a habit, particular time of day that people are collecting water. That makes it, like brushing your teeth. It's easier to develop a habit around that. At least that's a view in psychology. It was and that was designed to help facilitate social norm formation. And perhaps most importantly, it was provided to customers without a charge. And we saw that this increased water treatment by fourfold, and that increase was sustained when we tested it over the next 3 years. So that approach has now scaled up to reach about 2 million people across Kenya, Uganda, and Malawi. Now, I think that's one approach, and in some ways I think that's I'm very pleased that people are getting clean water this way. But I think it's a few gaps in the literature, some of which I'm working on now or hoping to work on. One is that there are other approaches. So I think some of you saw a piece that came out in Science with Pascaline Dupont and Vivian Hoffman. We were suggesting another possible approach would be to distribute coupons that would allow people to get a clean water solution for free without paying for it. In particular, allow women with young children or pregnant women to get this, where there's the health needs for clean water are particularly strong. We've tested at a small scale, but we'd love to test that at a larger scale. Another approach, which would be more technologically advanced than the dispenser, would be inline chlorination. That is not going to be feasible everywhere, but there are some settings where you can actually have a pipe, and you can have the appropriate engineering to have the right dose of chlorine solution for treatment in the pipe, and to do that at small scale, and that might lead to even higher take-up. There's a final aspect, which I think is directly on the moving away from the economics of this and to the or even the psychology and behavioral aspects of this, and going directly to the health issues, which is trying to understand the impact on child survival. So if you think about the goals and the Sustainable Development Goals and other goals, a lot of funders are making funding available for child survival. There's actually much less funding available for water treatment. And that's ironic, because we think of diarrheal disease as a major killer of children. One of the reasons for that is that we don't have evidence from randomized controlled trials on the impact of fecal contamination of water or of treatment of water on child survival. And why don't we have that evidence? Well, if somebody develops a vaccine and they have a patent on that vaccine, they may go out and do a very large-scale trial. They have economic incentives to do so. If the vaccine's is adopted, they'll be able to sell that and make money. But of course, water treatment, certainly water treatment with chlorine, that's not something one can patent. So there aren't incentives to do that type of large-scale trial. There may be some context, in particular using the dispenser, in which we will be able to do that, because you need a very large sample. If you're trying to get at child mortality, because it's a rare outcome, you need really a huge sample size. Mortality is fortunately not so common. So dispenser treats a whole community, which opens up the opportunity for a cluster randomized trial of this. And there's some work that I'm pursuing on that now, and very interested in trying to do more of that, and be interested in talking to people here about that. Okay, let me move on a little bit. As the final topic I wanted to discuss is institutions for innovation. And as I've argued, I think the experimental approach can be can be very useful for innovation. That's in part how we developed this dispenser. In part because its experimental approach allows the rapid feedback loops to learn what things aren't working, what things are working but still have problems, and help you iterate on that rapidly. Private firms are continuously doing their own experiments. So if you think about tech firms like Google or Amazon, they're constantly doing A/B tests, trying to find out how do they design the web page, how do they present the products to maximize the amount of products that they're going to sell. And they refine them, they scale things up that work. But there are some areas where the private sector won't invest as enthusiastically, even if innovation could serve important human needs. So I gave the example of how we don't have a randomized controlled trial looking at the impact of water treatment on mortality. And that's precisely because our current institutions, while they provide very good incentives for research and iteration in some areas, that's an area where they're not providing appropriate incentives. So a key insight from the study of innovation is that social choices around institutions determine both the pace of technological change, but also the direction of that change, and whether that change serves human needs or not. And I think there's room for innovation in the set of institutions society has created for advancing innovation. So let me discuss a few examples of that, or a few categories. One is institutions to facilitate innovation. A second is institutions to support innovation broadly. And a third is incentives for specific innovations. So just very briefly on the first, conducting these types of experimental work, that requires working. It's complex, it's collaborative, it requires working on larger scale than economists had previously worked. And that required developing a set of institutions to support that, such as the Poverty Action Lab at MIT or Innovations for Poverty Action. Second type of institution is funding institutions that support this type of work. And I just briefly wanted to mention one that I've been involved in called Development Innovation Ventures. So this is a fund within the US Agency for International Development that supports innovation for development from a wide variety of sources, including social entrepreneurs, for-profit firms, and researchers. DIVs deliberately open across sectors and geographies to innovations intended to scale either commercially or through developing country governments or donors. But it complements that approach with a tiered evidence-based approach to funding. So we make small investments to pilot or rigorously test promising ideas, but we reserve larger scale funding for innovations that are supported by rigorous empirical evidence, both of impact and of cost effectiveness. And we recently looked at our early portfolio, and one of the things we found, and I think this tends to be typical for research and innovation, it was true in our case, but it's true much more broadly, is that if you look at the distribution of number of people reached, most innovations are not going to succeed. They're not going to reach that many people. But there's a small group that have disproportionate impact, and those innovations can pay for the rest. So in particular, what we saw was that we looked at our first 43 innovations we supported, and we looked at the benefits. We tried to quantify the benefits of just 4 of them. And we found that the benefits of those 4 outweighed the costs of the entire portfolio of all 43 innovations that we supported. So, as you're, especially for the students out here, if you're involved in trials of things, many of them are going to fail. That's fine, because you just keep trying, and you will find things eventually, as either you individually or we collectively will find some things that succeed. And when you do find something that succeeds and it scales up in this way, then the impact is going to can be tremendous. Let me just I say one final aspect of institutional innovation, which is As we've noted, there are some areas where the private sector, under current institutions, isn't going to invest enough to match social needs. And Rachel Glenister and I were involved in an effort to try to find a way to harness the power and energy of private sector innovation to address the needs of some of the world's poorest people. So this was adopted by a group of donors and the Gates Foundation, which pledged $1.5 billion to pledge in advance that if a vaccine was developed that covered the strains of pneumococcus that were common in developing countries, they would help support the purchase of those vaccines. And the idea was really twofold. It was to create incentives for firms to work in this area, but also to ensure that there was access to the vaccines once they were developed. And after this was put in place, 2 firms developed the pneumococcus vaccines covering the strains of the disease common in the developing world. And those have now been distributed to more than 200 million children around the world. Now, I think that, as I've emphasized repeatedly, anytime we're working on an innovation, we need to tweak that over time. I think the example of the advanced market commitment for pneumococcus demonstrates it's a proof of concept that this type of approach can be executed and the vaccines can be delivered. I do think, I'd be happy to talk afterwards, that some tweaks to the approach are probably necessary, but I think it demonstrates the power of, if we think about our research system for diseases in rich countries, it's a mix of upfront public funding going to universities, but also a market to try to get the private sector involved. And I think we need to replicate that same pattern for diseases affecting developing countries as well. So, I think there's many areas for the future, lots of applications of machine learning, of big data, and I think if we want to encourage future research, if we want to broaden research out, encourage more collaborations across fields, economics, public health, other areas, we'll need to continue working not just on experiments, but trying to develop the institutions that we have to encourage innovation for public health and against poverty in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for which really relates much of what is done for education, but also this approach that is very high profile approach. In fact, using artificial intelligence to come up with the diagnostics when it comes to burn infections and other infections, infectious diseases in Kenya. But could I have just the first question is the privilege, of course. Running through your entire presentation is one key issue. You didn't use the term, but you were alluding to it. The commercial determinants of health. The commercial determinants of health, which make it difficult to implement changes that don't even be economically work. In the fields of infectious diseases, you have this coalition of epidemics, Ricardo's innovation now, which looks at this from a different angle. What is your take? How should we make progress when it comes to implementing changes that have no economic upside? Like what you mentioned with the clean water.
Well, I think so first let me, I think the issue is there actually is an economic upside. There's an economic upside for society as a whole, as we saw in the case of deworming. This was something that increased the earnings in the long run and sufficient to pay for the program 100 times over. But you're exactly right that the problem is that economic upside for society as a whole doesn't necessarily translate into incentives for a specific firm or even a specific politician to make these important health investments. So I think what we need to think about is how can we try to, at multiple levels, at the level of governments and at the level of firms, how can we try to devise mechanisms to make this possible and translate the social benefit into action on the ground. And in the case of government programs, finding a way that this can be done and actually implemented is very important. So I think obviously there was important health innovations to develop the medicine, but equally important was a social innovation, not one that I developed at all, but one that I studied, which was finding a way to administer the medicines in a way that was logistically feasible and not too costly. So it's very expensive to diagnose worm infection. It's very cheap to treat it. So the World Health Organization recommended that in areas where worms are endemic, the entire school be treated because the disease is concentrated among school children. That made it feasible for governments to do this. And then when we could provide evidence of the educational and economic impacts, ministries of education, ministries of finance got on board, and that's partly why this was able to scale. In the case of creating commercial incentives, advanced market commitments are one approach to doing that. There may be others, but I think we need to think about our systems for creating incentives for private companies. Ultimately, it does require public money.
So I mentioned the Department of Global Public Health, but we also have many students here from another important department, line. And I do encourage now students from these different departments to come up with questions. So please.
I just want to add that we will continue until 10 past.
Yes.
So we have some more time.
Ample time for questions. So here is the question.
Thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering if you find that you run into a lot of ethical challenges with the experimental approach with randomized control trials, and how you move past those so that you can actually implement things on a large scale after.
Right. These programs were, in the case of the deworming experiment, this was something that was done. This was a very small NGO. When I started working with them, they only worked in 7 schools. And so the way the deworming program was done was they expanded over time, and they knew they wouldn't be able to expand immediately to a large set of schools. So they initially introduced 25 schools, and then the next year 50, and eventually got to 75. And that was their plan. So what made it something that we could evaluate was they chose the order of randomization, the order of phase-in a way that made the groups comparable. Now, we still obviously went through ethical approval both in Kenya and in the United States, and that obviously is going to be very important. There was actually a change in the midst of the study. There was a change. The Kenyan government ethics rules changed. So remember I said there was 70%, when it was free, 70% of people were doing this. Initially, they didn't, the parents could withdraw their children from this, but they didn't have to actively sign up to do it. They changed the rules in the middle to say the parents have to actively sign up. Otherwise, the number of people participating would have been even higher. I don't think there were very few refusals, but often parents never got around to coming into school to sign this up, to sign up. So that, and it's a bit of a digression, but when you scale up these programs, the actual government programs that are done at large scale that don't have a research component, those typically the approaches, the presumption is that the child will be treated unless the parent actively says they don't want the child to be treated, and that has higher prevalence. So in this case, that obviously when they changed their guidelines, we implemented that, and that's why you saw the 70%. But more broadly, this is the issue is one of trying to design something that is that takes into account the ethical issues, and then having both the local and international review.
I think it's a question up here. Yeah. And please tell us from which program you which program?
Hi, from the epidemiology program, and I was wondering what you think about the responsibility that health economics has in like creating the incentive for certain studies, like the child mortality and cleaning of water, and how prevalent do you think that innovation is in the education of economics and the focus for in the whole thing?
So I think that I think that you mentioned you raised in your first question, you raised the example of the need for randomized trials on to look at the impact of water on child mortality. I think that I don't know what responsibility health economics has for that, but I think our larger funding system for research, we need to, if we have a funding system that's built primarily around, on the one hand, around biotech and pharmaceutical firms doing RCTs when they're trying to get something for regulatory approval, and then on the other hand, on funding basic research, then there'll be a gap in that funding system for some very important categories of work, particularly for global public health. And so I think the design of funding systems, or just the individual choices of funders, need to try to address some of those gaps. I don't know whether that's the responsibility of health economics or of the funders, but I think that is a very important area. And sorry, your other question?
Education economics, the focus on innovation and relating to health as well.
Right. So I think there's been first start with the positives, and then say where I think economics has further to go. I think there's been over the course of my career, I've seen much more interest in the intersection of health and economics within the economics profession, and that's true both for people working on issues of, say, the U.S. healthcare system, since I'm based in the U.S. Obviously, a critically important issue, but also for global health issue, and huge interest among students in the U.S. in this, and huge interest among faculty as well. There's also been, as I said at the very beginning, within economics, there's been I think a huge change. We had been, I don't want to unfairly caricature the profession, but I think that when I started, the presumption was very much one of rationality, and the approach was very much one of, you get an existing data set that you might not, that very rarely were you involved in collection of this data yourself, and you just put it on the computer, you look at the correlations, and you try to develop clever ways of analyzing the data to hope to get at causality. Certainly in the field of development economics, let me be clear, I think sometimes you can get amazing results that way. I'm not suggesting we abandon that approach altogether, but I think it's very useful to also have this approach that involves spending time in the field, getting a much richer and deeper sense of context. And certainly in development economics, there's been a huge shift towards that and a huge growth in that area. And I think that it's fair to say that that's where the great majority of young researchers are focusing their energies. There's still a lot more to be done. I still don't think that we see our job as, oddly enough, it's a very strange aspect of the culture of the economics profession. We sort of feel a little bit apologetic about saying, well, we want to innovate. It would be great if we come up with something like a dispenser. We see our job as writing papers, and we don't. I know in health, if somebody develops something that's effective against a disease, that's seen as the ultimate goal. For us, we're still seeing things as the ultimate goal is writing a paper. I'd love it to be that both are legitimate goals.
We're down to 2 additional questions. I think there was one up there. Sorry. 2 short questions, and there is one over here.
Thank you for the talk. I just have a question to the last points you raised in relations. You said 2 innovations paid off the rest of the other 30 or something innovations. I wondered, did you see common factors in those 2 innovations, and like common factors for innovations to actually work, and maybe something just in general?
Yeah. I could start on that one. Well, oh, yes, go ahead.
Usually when we have new technological innovations, access to those innovations is usually a challenge in developing countries.
Right.
So if you look at incentives, institutional incentives for innovations, how do you think these incentives can be provided that can, in a way that guarantees access to these innovations when they come up?
Great. 2 great questions. So let me start with the issue of access. So the approach that Rachel and I proposed, advanced market commitments, the way that approach works is the donors commit in advance that if a product that's needed in developing countries is produced, and it gets through regulatory approval, then the donors would commit to use some funds that to help finance the purchase of those. And so as part of the understanding is there'd be a commitment. They would agree to help purchase this at a pre-specified price. So the company that's producing this has to be willing to sell it at that price, and then the funds are available from the donors, either to cover the entire price or to cover all but a small co-payment that the countries would be expected to come up with. So, so this approach sort of simultaneously is creating incentives for the companies to do the research, but it's also helping ensure that if the product is developed, there'd be access to it afterwards. Now I've forgotten the first question. Can you just remind me of that again? I remember it was very good, but yes, the predictors of successful. So look, let me preface this by saying we had a sample size of 43. So take this with a grain of salt. This is work that we're currently doing to analyze our portfolio. But there were some fascinating patterns. So one of them is, so we supported both social entrepreneurs and people who are trying to develop a product and sell it, and researchers who are hoping to develop something that could be, for example, adopted by a government or by a large business. What we saw was that it's a very difficult strategy to try to sell something to the ultimate consumer. The customer acquisition costs are huge. So it was much more likely to scale if something was being sold to an existing entity that already had the distribution network. And that could be either a large business, or it could be government adopting it. There wouldn't be selling it, but adoption by it. Another thing was, we found that, as I mentioned, we give sort of small funding for piloting and testing and larger amounts of funding for transitioning things that already have evidence to scale. So as you can imagine, we had a higher success rate for the later stage grants. But if you looked at the number of people reached per dollar spent, it was actually larger for some of the smaller, for initial early stage work. So I think trying to design research funding institutions to support the early stage is very important. And then the final bit, and I guess I'm going to sound very biased on this, but some of the projects had social science research involved, and social science researchers in development. And there would have been a view that social science and economists in particular are maybe ivory tower, and that what they do will never scale. We actually saw a much higher rate of scaling among the innovations that had social science researchers involved than among the ones that didn't. I think there's a role for, I wouldn't take the lesson from that you need social science researchers as to be part of every project, but rather I would say, as we think about the types of people who can be involved in innovation, let's not just think about for-profit firms or technologists. They have obviously we know they can do tremendous things, but I think we're now at a stage where social scientists also have a role to play and can join that broader movement. So thank you.
Thank you. We have a very, very time schedule we have received, but I will have one very short question and a very short answer from your opponent.
That's tricky. I wanted to start with your trajectory.
Why don't you, President, just interrupt? What a fantastic trajectory. Father architect, mother professor of literature, you became economist, you moved into the real world, and you did the RCTs, and you have had scale-ups and policy impact that very few can dream of. So you have a big responsibility. How do you select the problems for starting? That's question number one. And question number two, and you don't have to answer, that is your experience in institutional strengthening, because without strengthened institutions in lower middle income countries, forget the impact.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just give a short answer, not answering the general question, but just giving one specific example. There's, I think one very exciting area for the future is digital development and, using the rich data that countries have, the ability to reach people through cell phones. And one project that I'm very excited about, which is in agriculture, but I think there's many applications in other fields, education, health, is working with the government of Ethiopia, which set up a system for communicating with farmers about basically giving agricultural advice to them based on the weather, soil type, etc. And they had set up a system, but it was actually quite an impressive system. But by analyzing the data in that and working with the people in the Ethiopian government, who are really excellent, they were able to identify areas where it looked like it wasn't working as well, and then devise A/B tests to try alternative approaches. And they tried them, and they found what worked, and they've adopted them. And developing that capacity, that requires people in the Ethiopian government, that requires bringing in some external experts with this type of expertise who can bring in experiences from other governments. But setting up that type of unit is, I think, a great direction for the future. Thank you.